Have you ever seen a person walk into the woods
Stay with me.
to die
I've got you.
and then get killed by the very thing they thought was going to save them? In the early 90s, a 59-year-old nurse named Helen Morrow left behind a life of sirens, emergency rooms, and sleepless nights to vanish into the snowy ridges of the Smoky Mountains. But just when she was about to surrender to the cold, a sound stopped her. A strange, fragile cry. Not quite human. What she found changed everything. A wounded creature the world refuses to believe in, cradling its dying child. She did what she'd done her whole life. She saved a life. Only this time, it wasn't a patient. It was a young Bigfoot. 20 years later, when Helen collapsed from a heart attack deep in the forest, that same creature, now grown, came back and saved her. Yes, there is a photograph. Yes, this really happened. But more than proof, this is a story of healing, of second chances, of wild things that love back. And now I want to ask you, wherever you're watching from, what's your name, dear viewer? Could this story reach someone who needs it today? I'd be honored if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and help build a gentle, curious community that believes in more than just monsters. A community that believes in Bigfoot and in each other. The last night of autumn settled over the Smoky Mountains like a heavy, unfinished sentence. Fog pooled thick along the ridge above Townsend, Tennessee, softening the pines into tall gray silhouettes. Inside the small research cabin perched on the slope, a lantern's amber glow pushed back the darkness just enough for a single woman to sit at a wooden table, her hands hovering over a blank notebook. The page waited for something clinical, something neat. Field notes. Day 1. But the first words she pressed onto the paper were nothing close to science. They came out shaky, as though her bones carried the weight of them long before her pen ever touched the page. "Corinne, I'm sorry." The lantern hissed softly. Outside, the wind brushed the walls like someone trying to knock without waking the house. Helen Morrow exhaled, long and trembling, and for a moment she didn't look like a medical professional on assignment. She looked like a woman who had run out of time in too many ways, too many years ago, and had finally decided to stop pretending she hadn't noticed. Her truck was still cooling outside, a dusty old Ford that had groaned all the way up Laurel Fork Service Road. The wooden sign at the bottom of the mountain, "Authorized Personnel Only," was faded, but she had followed it anyway, letting the truck rattle along the steep dirt path while a country radio station crackled through static. The road felt like it was carrying her farther away from the world she'd failed, and closer to something she didn't yet have a name for. 59 years carved long shadows across Helen's face. Her hair had turned the color of morning frost, thin and uneven, the sort that showed she cut it herself with little care for the result. But her hands betrayed a past she couldn't shed, the quick, precise habits of a nurse. Even as she unpacked her duffel in the dim cabin, she folded her towel sharply, lined her medical kit against the wall, and checked the stove's hinges like it was a patient's vitals. And yet her eyes, the tired, deep-set eyes that had forgotten how to rest, carried the bruised hollowness of someone who had spent too many nights replaying a moment she could never rewrite. The cabin was smaller than she expected. A metal bunk bed, a narrow wood stove, shelves filled with binders and books labeled "Unknown Bipedal Creature." A steel locker tucked in the corner held reels of old footage and photographs of dark shapes between trees. Nothing in the room tried to be warm. It was a place built for watching, not living. When she arrived earlier that afternoon, Dr. Marshall Kincaid had been waiting outside with his hands buried in the pockets of a windbreaker that seemed too thin for the cold. He was in his early 50s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of posture that belonged to a man who preferred theories over people. He welcomed her with a handshake that felt like a formality rather than interest, and walked her inside without asking about her long drive. "We keep things simple here," he had said, flipping a switch on a small monitor. This project focuses on verifiable evidence. No myths, no tall tales. His voice grew steadier as he continued. The cadence of a man who believed science could be coaxed from shadows if you stared at them long enough. He explained her duties: to provide medical support to the team, to handle any injuries or health emergencies, and, hesitating only a moment, to assess any biological anomalies if contact was made with the subject of their research. He pressed play on the old screen. The image flickered to life, grainy and trembling, but unmistakably real. A towering figure moving between the pines, shoulders wide enough to block half the frame, walking upright with a heavy, purposeful stride. The creature turned slightly, its silhouette swallowing the weak afternoon light before vanishing behind a spruce. The fog outside the cabin window shifted, catching Helen's reflection on the dark glass. For a heartbeat, the woman watching the footage and the creature captured in it felt like two beings trapped in the same silent observation. "If we manage to recover a sample," Kincaid had said, his voice tight with ambition, "a single hair, a drop of blood, even a carcass, your name will join mine on the published findings. It would be historic." Helen didn't look away from the frozen frame on the monitor when she replied, "I've seen enough people die to know history doesn't hold you at night." Kincaid blinked, unsure if it was an answer or a warning, but he didn't probe further. He left before dusk, promising to return in a few days. When the door closed behind him, the silence returned with an almost physical weight. Hours later, alone in the cabin, Helen set her clothes into their new corners and placed her old nurse's notebook beside the lantern. She found a faded photograph wedged between the pages. Her husband standing with their daughter at a county fair, both smiling, unaware of the grief their future held. Helen traced the image with her thumb. The day her husband died in a mill accident, he was brought into the hospital on a stretcher during her shift. But he never made it to her station. Corinne's voice still pierced through her memory. "You came late. Like always." Even after all these years, the words hadn't dulled. Outside, the fog rolled across the clearing, and the forest breathed against the windows. She tried again to write the field report she was supposed to produce. Weather, cold, fog-heavy. Conditions, stable. But the page blurred. Her hand drifted, and suddenly she was writing to her daughter again, telling her the things she hadn't dared say aloud, confessing how the guilt had driven cracks into everything she touched. Wind pressed harder against the cabin. The lantern flickered. A faint tapping echoed through the night. Soft, irregular, like something wooden striking something else far away. Helen paused, listening. Maybe it was a branch swaying, or the rickety old structure settling its bones in the cold. She finished her sentence, closed the notebook, and let the thought drift away. When morning came, the Smokies were pale under the thin wash of winter sunlight. Helen opened the cabin door and froze. 3 narrow sticks, stripped clean, pointed at one end, were driven into the frost a few yards away, perfectly straight, perfectly aligned toward her front steps. They hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of that. She stepped closer, breath fogging the air, and crouched to examine them. The wood wasn't carved, more like snapped and sharpened by hands that didn't use knives, or claws, or something in between. She reached out but stopped short of touching them. For a long moment she simply stood there, the valley silent around her, the fog beginning to thin. The world felt paused, as if holding some ancient breath. The mountains had seen her arrival. Something else had too. She straightened slowly. Inside her chest, an ache stirred. Familiar, heavy, but tinged with something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the uncomfortable awareness of being witnessed by something that didn't belong to the human world, and yet wasn't entirely outside it either. She walked back to the cabin, closing the door with a soft click. Her hand drifted to the wedding ring she still wore, twisting it once. The air smelled faintly of cold metal and pine resin. She looked again at her notebook lying open on the table, the half-finished confession staring back at her. She whispered into the quiet room, almost to herself, almost to the man she still spoke to in the dark when the memories grew too sharp. "Maybe coming up here is the first time I've ever shown up for my own life." Her voice lingered, fragile as the fading fog. The Smokies answered with a long, low sigh of wind moving through their endless trees, carrying her words into the silent ridges beyond. There was no one here to witness her except the mountains, and whatever intelligence had planted those 3 quiet markers outside her door. The day stretched forward, thin and gray. But a current had shifted. She felt it in the way the floorboards creaked, in the stillness between gusts, in the uneasy throb beneath her ribs. Something had noticed her arrival, long before she ever considered noticing herself. And though she didn't know it yet, not fully, not consciously, this place had already begun to unearth the pieces she thought she'd buried forever. She stepped to the window, watching the tree line, waiting for the fog to rise completely, waiting for the day to make up its mind. But part of her, the part that had been numb for so many years, felt something else emerging too. A tremor, a breath, a presence she couldn't name. And somewhere deeper in the woods, something shifted its weight, watching her from behind the veil of trees, just as she watched the mountain return to stillness. The day moved on. She remained at the window a moment longer, her fingers brushing the glass, the wedding ring cool against her skin. The forest held its silence, but the silence was no longer empty. It was expectant, as if the mountains themselves were waiting to see whether the woman alone in the cabin would run from her ghosts, or finally, painfully, begin to face them. A story had already started moving toward her, step by step, through the trees. And she had no idea how closely it was about to change the course of her life. Cold rain swept across the Smokies like a long dark sleeve wiping the ridge clean. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped lower than any early winter storm Helen could remember, and the little cabin shuddered under the weight of the wind. She lay awake on the thin mattress, listening to the brittle creak of the rafters and the irregular drip from the gutter outside. Every now and then the floor trembled, just slightly, as though the mountain itself was shifting its shoulders beneath her. The lantern on the table cast a weak circle of gold that barely touched the corners of the room, and the glass in her water cup twitched with each small vibration. She didn't move. She didn't stop it either. She just watched the ceiling beam above her, waiting for the noise, waiting for some decisive break in the night, the way a person waits for a thought they're afraid to say out loud. The last few days had passed in a quiet pattern. She had walked the perimeter each morning, replaced the audio tapes in the trees, marked down weather changes, and listened to the faraway knocks that occasionally drifted from deeper in the woods. But nothing else had come close. No figure between the pines, no flash of dark movement. Just echoes that felt more like the mountain muttering to itself than anything living. And though the project demanded she treat those signs with clinical curiosity, she never felt excitement. Only a strange, unanchored focus. Something that kept her busy enough not to think about the page on her desk that waited for a different kind of ending. Dr. Kincaid had already left 2 days earlier, hurrying down the mountain to handle what he called department matters. He said he'd be gone a few days, maybe more. He'd left her with a shortwave radio, a supply list, and the assurance that a truck would be sent up after a week if weather allowed. But he never asked if she was comfortable being alone. He assumed people could survive their own solitude the way they survived cold nights. He never understood the difference. Sometime in the darkest part of the night, the storm changed shape. Rain hardened into tiny pellets of ice that clicked against the window pane like fingernails tracing a warning. The wind curled under the roof and pushed. Then a deep rumble rose from somewhere below the ridge. Too long to be thunder, too heavy to be imagination. The mountain shivered, a low rolling motion that traveled through the soil, up the beams, into the bed frame, and under her ribs. It was the kind of movement that made you realize the earth could shrug you off like dust if it wanted. The tremor faded. Silence poured back in. Helen didn't move. Morning was a gray wash of sky, cold enough that her breath fogged inside the cabin before she even opened the door. She stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching the thin glaze of ice that had formed overnight. A few pine branches lay scattered around the clearing, cracked in half by the storm. The air felt sharp, metallic, like something had scraped the edges of the forest raw. She walked toward the trail that wound down the mountain. At first, she only saw mud. Then the destruction revealed itself all at once. The narrow road had collapsed in one long slide of soil and rock, blocking the descent entirely. A massive tangle of uprooted trees sprawled across the slope, their roots jutting upward like ribs. Ice clung to the broken limbs. The whole path, her only way off the ridge, was buried. She stared at it without speaking. The cold stung her face, but she barely felt it. She had expected obstacles up here. She hadn't expected the mountain to close its own door behind her. She climbed a little farther, boots slipping in the soft mud, until she saw the bent remains of the antenna pole sprawled down the incline. The cable had snapped clean. The metal housing was shattered open, wires exposed like nerves. She knelt beside it and touched the broken shaft. It was cold enough to burn. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something like a strange, weightless release. She stood there for a moment, letting the truth settle. No way down the mountain. No way to call for help. No one coming for days, maybe weeks. She wasn't cut off by accident. She was cut off, period. Back inside the cabin, the radio hissed in her hands, nothing but static. She adjusted the knob once, twice, a dozen times. Nothing. The silence was complete. She placed the radio on the table and sat down slowly. It should have frightened her. The thought of being trapped, isolated, unreachable. People would panic, but Helen didn't. Instead, a thin, hollow calm spread through her like warm water filling a cracked bowl. She didn't have to hurry anywhere. She didn't have to answer a call. She didn't have to face the conversation she'd been avoiding for years. She didn't have to explain herself to the daughter who had every right not to answer. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing she could fail. She opened the notebook again, the same notebook she had used during her nursing shifts and long nights in emergency rooms. This time, the page wasn't for field notes or weather updates. She began writing instructions. Legal, practical, painfully clear. Bank accounts, insurance. The small house in Knoxville that Corinne could sell or keep, depending on what she wanted. She wrote apologies, not the kind that begged for forgiveness, but the kind that admitted she no longer expected it. She tried to explain that she wasn't leaving because she didn't love her daughter. She was leaving because she no longer knew how to step toward her without breaking something inside them both. Her handwriting wavered. She stopped once or twice, staring into the lantern flame. Then she wrote again, softer, slower, like she was finally allowing herself to speak a truth she'd always swallowed before. By midday, she folded the letter and slid it into the inner pocket of her coat. She stared at the coat for a long moment before putting it on. The air outside had thickened with the promise of more cold, the trees stiff with frost, the breeze sharper. She gathered her backpack, but not the things that would help her find her way. She hid the compass under the mattress, left the headlamp on the shelf, put the knife back in the drawer. She wanted the weight of choice to be smaller now. She wanted the path to take her where it would, without guidance. She slipped her hands into the coat pockets, felt the folded letter press against her chest, and closed her eyes. "This is the one thing I can arrive on time for," she whispered, barely audible. She stepped off the porch and headed into the forest. Snow flurries drifted in the wind. Branches sagged under the cold. The silence felt older than the age of the trees, a deep quiet that made each footstep sound louder than it should. She walked without hesitation, following the slope deeper, letting the mountain swallow the cabin behind her. Her boots slipped on patches of ice. She didn't correct her balance quickly. Part of her didn't want to. Hours seemed to blur into one long ache in her legs. She moved through the fog like she was walking through someone else's memory, weightless, untethered. A few times she stopped to rest her hand against a tree, breathing slow, watching the soft swirl of white against the darkness between the trunks. She didn't feel scared. She only felt the strange numbness that comes after too many years of holding yourself together. By late afternoon, she reached a steep ridge where the ground dropped away into a narrow ravine. The rocks beneath her feet were slick with mud and melting ice. She took one step, then another. Her boots slid. Her weight shifted. The world tilted. Suddenly there was no ground beneath her, only air and the sharp yank of gravity pulling her downward. She flung her hands out, fingers clawing at nothing until they caught a single, exposed root jutting from the ridge. Her body swung heavy and off balance, legs dangling over the void. The cold bit into her palms. She clung to the root, breath held tight in her throat. Below her, the ravine yawned open, jagged rocks half hidden under thin snow. One slip and she would fall all the way to the bottom. It would be quick. It would be final. It would be the end she had walked toward all day. For a moment she relaxed her grip just enough to feel the root shift. It would take nothing, nothing at all, to let go. The wind rushed past her ears. The forest held its breath. Her heartbeat drummed painfully in her ribs, louder than the storm, louder than the world. She closed her eyes. Then a sound rose from deep within the trees. A long, strained cry. Choked, broken, not human, not animal. Something somewhere in between. It wasn't the sound of something hunting. It was the sound of something trying to breathe through pain. A small, desperate wail that trembled at the edge of surrender. Helen's eyes snapped open. The sound came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. A plea, a warning, a suffering she recognized in her bones. Her fingers tightened around the root before she even understood why. She hauled herself upward, boots scraping against frozen rock, until her chest hit solid ground. She lay there a moment, panting, snow melting against her cheek. The cry echoed again, faint, fading, as though it were slipping from the world even as she listened. She pushed herself to her knees. Something out there needed help. Something alive. Something alone. Her hands shook as she stood, not from cold, but from the sudden break in the numbness she had carried for so long. The mountain hadn't pushed her away. It had called her back. She turned toward the sound and stepped into the trees, breath unsteady, heart pounding with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. The letter in her coat pocket brushed against her ribs with each step, but its weight no longer felt like a destination. It felt like a question, and somewhere ahead, hidden between stone and shadow, something waited for her answer. The sound guided her deeper into the trees, faint at first, barely more than a fragile thread of breath pulled through cold air. She followed it as though it were a memory calling her name, soft, hurting, impossible to ignore. Snow thickened around her boots, the ground turning slick with frozen mud. Branches heavy with ice brushed her coat as she passed, scattering small crystals that glittered briefly before melting into the fabric. Her lungs burned from the cold, but she didn't slow down. Something small and suffering had cried out, and the instinct she'd tried to bury under years of exhaustion rose without asking permission. A narrow crease in the ridge opened ahead, shaped by time and storms. She slipped between two boulders, the space just wide enough for a person to pass sideways. Cold air funneled through the gap like a quiet warning. Beyond it, the earth dipped into a shallow rock shelter, barely a cave, more a hollow scooped out by centuries of rain. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted, metallic, earthy, the unmistakable scent of blood already cooling. She stopped at the threshold, breath stumbling in her chest. For a second she thought the shadows were playing tricks on her, but then they shifted, solid and unmistakable. A massive form lay curled near the back wall, its fur matted with dried blood, its limbs arranged in the haunting stillness that only comes after the last breath. A female, larger than any human but built with the unmistakable shape of a creature that walked upright. Shoulders broad enough to block the narrow cave. Long arms draped protectively around something held tight against her chest. Helen stepped closer without realizing her feet had moved. Her mind should have been racing, but some part of her settled instead, steady, sharp, as though every fear she ever carried had fallen silent. The creature had been dead long enough for rigor to fade. Her eyes were half open, fixed in a painful kind of peace, and her face, far more human than the stories ever guessed, held a final expression that reached under Helen's ribs with a slow twist. Not rage, not terror, grief, as though she had fought her last breath only to protect what lay beneath her. Helen crouched beside the body, the cold stone biting through her kneecaps. She touched nothing. She just watched the way the light brushed across the creature's face, revealing the slope of the brow, the set of the cheekbones, the width of the nose flattened against the earth. A mother, she realized. Whatever else this being had been in life, she had been a mother first. A faint, trembling whimper pulled Helen's attention downward. Nestled under the heavy arm, pressed against the lifeless chest, was something smaller. Small only in comparison to the gigantic form that sheltered it. Fur tangled with dirt and leaves, little body shivering in uneven spasms, breath shallow and frighteningly quick. The child, because that's what it was, no matter the species, clung to the mother's torso, tiny fingers curled into a fist around a patch of dried fur. Helen moved slowly, her hands hovering above the two bodies as though she had stepped into a holy space where every gesture mattered. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cave. The words were instinctive, spoken without thought, meant for the living and the dead all at once. The small creature stirred. Its fur was a deep brown, streaked with lighter patches around the arms and chest. Its face remained half buried against the mother's ribs. When it lifted its head, she saw eyes shining with a raw, animal fear that made her heart jolt. They were wide and unfocused, glassy from the cold, the kind of eyes she had seen on human infants in ICU units when their bodies were shutting down. She leaned in, studying its breathing. Too shallow, too uneven. The cold was winning. She reached for the child, then pulled her hand back. Every part of her training screamed for caution. Every part of her soul screamed for urgency. A low rumble rolled through the distance outside the cave. Distant enough not to be a threat, yet close enough to remind her she wasn't alone in these woods. Whether it was a bear or another of this creature's kind, she didn't know. But she had been around enough suffering to understand that the moment you start counting dangers, someone dies. She moved forward, placing a palm gently near the child's side, letting it smell her skin, feel her warmth. Its breath hitched. One tiny shaking hand lifted. It pressed against her wrist. Weak, but intentional. That was enough. "I've got you," she murmured. Not loud, not forcing calm. Just the truth shaped into sound. She slipped her hands under the little body. Even in its weakened state, it was heavier than she expected, dense with muscle, warm where life still clung. As she lifted it free, the child let out a sound so faint it was almost a sigh. The mother's stiffened arm fell away as the weight left her chest, and for one fragile instant, Helen bowed her head toward the lifeless giant in a silent promise she didn't yet fully understand. A thin braided loop of dried grass circled the child's wrist, woven with care, intricate in a way that spoke of culture, not instinct. She traced the pattern with her thumb, recognizing it as something meaningful, something placed there by hands that loved. Outside the cave, the air felt sharper, harsher, as though the forest had been holding still out of respect. The cold hit the child immediately, triggering a sudden, weak shiver that traveled through its entire frame. Helen pulled it close to her chest, shielding it with her coat, letting her own body heat wrap around it even as her skin prickled from the exposure. "You're freezing," she whispered. voice breaking as she tightened her hold. "Stay with me! Don't you dare go!" A sound stirred behind her, the soft crack of a branch under weight. She turned, heart thudding, eyes scanning the gray woods. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. But the sense of being watched pressed against the back of her neck, heavy, primal, undeniable. She didn't linger. She didn't give the forest a chance to decide whether her presence was welcome. She clutched the child tighter, tucking its head under her chin, and stepped into the open snow. The journey back felt longer than the one out. Every breath fogged and vanished in the cold air. The storm clouds lowered themselves over the ridge until it felt like she was walking inside the throat of the mountain. The weight of the child grew heavier with every step. Not physically, but emotionally. An impossible responsibility pressed into her arms by fate she never asked for but couldn't refuse. The forest shifted with quiet sounds behind them. Soft footsteps, a branch swaying where wind hadn't touched, shapes that stayed just beyond the edge of her vision. She didn't look back. She'd spent too many years listening to fear whisper in her ear. Now something else was speaking, softer, steadier. The little body in her arms trembled again. Its breath fluttered against her throat. When she tightened her hold, she felt the faintest response. One tiny hand gripping the fabric of her coat, clinging with all the strength it had left. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'm right here." The path to the cabin appeared like a memory rising from the fog. She stumbled the last few feet, boots slipping on the icy steps. The door swung inward with a creak as she pushed her way inside, heatless air rushing to greet her. The cabin felt unbearably cold. She dropped to her knees beside the wood stove. One arm still wrapped around the child, while the other fumbled with the fire starter, hands clumsy from the cold. The match finally sparked, catching on the thin bundle of tinder until flames licked the logs with a weak glow. She laid the child on a folded blanket beside the stove, but only long enough to strip off her coat and sweaters, layering them over its small form. Then she gathered it into her arms again, letting her body become a second furnace for its failing warmth. Little by little, the child's shaking slowed. Not enough to calm her, but enough to keep her breathing. She reached for a bowl, filled it with warm, not hot water, and dipped a cloth into it. Gently, she wiped its face, its arms, its chilled hands. The fur softened under the moisture, revealing bruises beneath, a few shallow cuts, nothing that explained the mother's death or the child's collapse. Hypothermia, exposure, maybe hunger, maybe grief. She had seen children who refused food after losing their mothers. She had held them at 2 a.m, whispering into their hair because sometimes that was all a nurse could do. The memory lodged itself in her throat like a sharp stone. The child let out a small sound, a soft, broken rumble, as she touched its cheek. Its eyes fluttered open, unfocused but searching. Instinctively, it leaned toward her hand, its tiny fingers brushing her wrist again. The gesture was clumsy, shaky, yet full of something so raw and trusting that Helen felt her own breath tremble. "You're safe," she whispered. "I've got you." She prepared thin oatmeal, mashed soft with a bit of warm water, and held a spoon near its lips. The child sniffed weakly, then opened its mouth just enough to try. The first bite dribbled down its chin, but she caught it with the cloth. The second bite stayed. The third, it swallowed with effort. She praised every attempt softly, her voice steady even as tears burned behind her eyes. When she had fed it enough to settle its trembling stomach, she laid it against her chest, skin to skin, letting her warmth seep into its bones. Its small body curled against her instinctively, the way human infants sought the rhythm of a heartbeat. She felt the faint vibration of a low, rumbling sound, almost like a deep purr, resonating through her ribs as it pressed itself closer. Hours passed without her noticing. The daylight faded, replaced by the soft pulse of the firelight reflecting on the cabin walls. She didn't move. She didn't dare. The child slept lightly, breath brushing her collarbone, each exhale proof that she had not been too late this time. A faint thump against the outer wall startled her. She opened her eyes, listening. Another sound, light, deliberate. A tapping as though someone, or something, was marking its presence. She rose carefully, laying the child onto the warm blankets by the stove. When she opened the cabin door, the cold knifed into her lungs. The porch was empty. Nothing moved but a swirl of snow. Yet on the railing sat a small bundle of dried grass, braided tightly, matching the loop around the child's wrist. Someone had come. Someone had watched her bring the child home. She looked into the trees. Nothing answered. The forest stood silent, but its silence no longer felt indifferent. She stepped inside, shutting the door slowly, and leaned her back against it. Her breath shook out of her chest with a weight she had carried too long. She walked to the table, picked up her field notebook, and opened it. For a moment she stared at the blank page where she was supposed to record clinical observations. Instead, she wrote the only line that made sense after the day she had lived. "Tonight, I held a child against my chest and begged him to stay." The words steadied her in a way she hadn't expected. She closed the notebook, set it down, and turned toward the small shape curled by the fire. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but the letter in her coat pocket no longer felt like a destination. It felt like a forgotten draft of a story that had changed direction the moment she stepped into that cave. And somewhere outside, hidden among the endless trees, the mountain waited to see what this woman, who had arrived too late to too many things, would choose to do now that life had placed something fragile in her arms again. She moved to the child, lifted him gently, and whispered into the quiet room, "I'm here." And for the first time in a long time, she meant it. The cabin, built for scientific observation and sterile hypothesis, had never been intended to hold life the way it now did. That night, its sharp corners and metal bunks disappeared behind the soft urgency of breath, the muted rustle of blankets, and the slow, uncertain pulse of something deeply fragile coming back from the edge. Helen moved like a woman who'd done this 100 times, and also never once before. The child, no, the being, lay on a nest of folded towels near the stove, its damp fur steaming faintly as the heat began to thaw it from the inside out. She had cranked the fire too high at first, the cabin filled with smoke, her hands trembling as she adjusted the flue. It took 3 tries to get it right. Her sleeves were soaked from melted snow, but she didn't notice. She only watched the slow twitching of the creature's chest, measured each exhale with the eyes of someone who had watched too many flatlines on too many monitors. The fur along its arms was coarser than she expected. The muscles underneath were too defined for a human child, but not so foreign she couldn't read them. It was a body shaped by survival, and it was failing. She soaked cloth after cloth in warm water, wrung them out until they steamed, then pressed them gently against the child's sides, its neck, its wrists. She rotated through limbs, careful not to overwhelm, keeping the heat slow and steady. Its eyes didn't open, but a soft, involuntary twitch in the fingertips told her it wasn't gone. Not yet. When the shivering turned from erratic to rhythmic, she allowed herself to breathe again. She took her old nurse's field bag, the one that hadn't seen real use in years, and felt the familiar weight of tools inside. Nothing here would work the way a hospital would. No machines, no IVs. But her hands knew what to do, and more importantly, her presence knew how to stay calm, and that mattered more than medicine sometimes. She boiled water, cooled it, ladled a little into a shallow ceramic bowl, and dipped the edge of a spoon into it. Then she made something close to food, a watery mix of oats, mashed with the heel of her palm and softened with heat and patience. She didn't force it. She let the smell fill the cabin, then crouched low, bringing the spoon near its lips. It didn't move. She dipped her finger, touched its mouth. A minute reaction, a twitch. She waited, then tried again. The third time, the child opened its mouth. Not wide, not hungry, just enough. The spoon clinked gently against a sharp tooth. A weak swallow followed. Then another. She didn't smile. Not yet, but her hand lingered a second longer on its forehead. It wasn't science that guided her that night. It wasn't even training. It was something older, something that lived in the quiet corners of people who had once failed to save someone and had never forgiven themselves for it. By the time the child's breathing settled into a slow, almost human rhythm, Helen had changed into dry clothes and spread a thick blanket over the mattress. She lifted it carefully, heavier now from warmth, its fur releasing the musky, earthy scent of something deeply wild, and laid it against her chest. She adjusted her coat as a second layer around both their bodies. One of its small hands, now warm, curled against her ribs. She felt it then. A sound. Not a cry, not a breath. A low, soft vibration deep in the creature's chest. Like the quiet purr of an enormous cat, but slower, heavier, with something almost mournful folded inside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't meant for her. It was survival's lullaby, the body's way of saying, I'm still here. Barely, but I'm here. She stayed like that, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Snow tapped lightly at the windows. The stove crackled in intervals. Shadows danced across the cabin ceiling like passing thoughts. And she could feel it. That tiny thrum of life curled against her, each beat syncing with her own. She had never had that with Corinne. Not like this. Not skin to skin, not breath to breath. Corinne had been born during a rushed shift change, screaming and red-faced while the nurse next to her said congratulations. Helen had held her, of course, but only after someone else cleaned her. Only after someone else wrapped her in sterile cloth. This was different. She didn't try to name what was forming inside her. Some bonds don't need names. By dawn, the storm had passed. The light came in thin and hesitant through the frosted windows, brushing the floorboards with silver. Helen stirred slightly, neck stiff, arms numb. The child hadn't moved. She eased away, careful not to disturb its warmth, and walked barefoot across the cold floor to fetch her notebook. She sat by the table, flipped to a blank page, stared at the lined paper. Her hand hovered over the top margin, where protocol demanded the date, time, subject ID. Instead, she wrote, "Tonight I held a child against my chest and begged him to stay." She looked at the sentence, her breath catching in her throat. Then she closed the notebook and left it there, untouched by science. By the stove, the child stirred. She walked back slowly, knelt beside it, watching its head turn slightly toward the warmth. When its eyes opened fully for the first time, they locked on hers. Not with fear, not anymore, but with the raw recognition of something deeply primitive. This is the one who stayed. She touched its arm. "You need a name," she whispered. Its fur was still matted with dirt and broken bits of the forest. Leaves, mud, pieces of bracken ferns clung stubbornly to its sides. She thought of the place she'd found it, tucked beneath those ferns, curled in grief beneath its mother's arm. "Bracken," she said aloud, tasting the name, letting it settle. "How's that for a name, little one?" The child didn't react to the word, but its breath eased. Its hand reached out and rested gently on the edge of her coat. Later that day, while Bracken slept in a makeshift bed of blankets, Helen walked to the edge of the porch. The snow had softened in the sun. She stepped out into the clearing, squinting into the trees. The forest was quiet, but not empty. 3 faint footprints circled the cabin, large and heavy, keeping a deliberate distance from the walls. She knelt, brushing snow from the edges. They were fresh, bare, toes long, spread wide like a primate's but larger than any human. They hadn't approached the door. They'd come close enough to see, but not close enough to challenge. She stood up slowly. Someone had been watching, and not for the first time. That evening, As dusk deepened and the trees turned dark against the sky, Helen warmed more broth and helped Bracken sip from a wooden spoon. He was stronger now, still weak, still guarded, but present. His eyes tracked her when she moved. He shifted to stay near the heat, and when she reached to pick him up, he leaned forward willingly, settling against her shoulder like a child too tired to protest. She sat in the chair by the stove, rocking gently without thinking, brushing her fingers through the tangles in his fur. His body pressed against hers, just like the night before, but this time it wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. That's when she heard it. A soft sound, 3 taps, very light, wood on wood. She rose, moved to the door, opened it slowly. No wind, no animals, just stillness. And on the porch railing, tied carefully with twine made of dried vine, lay a small bundle of braided grass, woven with the same careful pattern that circled Bracken's wrist. Her breath caught. Not a threat, not a warning. An offering, a marker, a message. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. She stood there a long time, hand resting on the door frame, heart knocking louder than the forest. They knew. They'd come close enough to see him, and for now, they hadn't taken him back. When she stepped inside again, Bracken was awake. His eyes met hers. She couldn't say for sure, but something in the way he tilted his head told her he already knew they'd been visited. She sat beside him, lifting him gently into her lap, holding him again like a mother who didn't know how else to promise she wouldn't let go. "I don't know what's going to happen," she whispered. "But you're not a secret anymore." Outside, the wind moved through the trees with long, low breaths. Inside, 2 heartbeats kept time with the fire, and the page with the old letter she once meant to leave behind now sat folded in a drawer, quiet, forgotten, unneeded, because this cabin wasn't a research station anymore. It had become something else entirely, and the mountain had noticed. The fire had burned low overnight, and the cold had crept back in through the floorboards like a memory trying to reclaim its place. But the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It breathed now, soft, uneven, alive. Helen stirred first, her joints stiff from the floor and the way she'd slept half upright, cradling Bracken's weight against her chest. The child hadn't moved much. His breath was shallow but steady, his warmth tucked inside the cocoon of old quilts and borrowed sweaters. When she looked down and saw his hand curled around the edge of her sleeve, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge. It was morning, just barely. Pale light bled through the windows like watercolors. Frost etched the edges of the glass in fragile spiderwebs. She rose carefully, easing away from Bracken without breaking the contact completely, then stoked the stove back to life, adding small logs and blowing gently on the flame until it caught and grew. The pop and hiss of the wood echoed in the quiet. Behind her, a soft rustle. She turned. Bracken was awake, propped weakly on one elbow, his eyes tracking her across the room. Not afraid, just watching. She crouched, voice low and steady. "Hey there, little one." He didn't respond. But when she reached for the bowl on the counter and brought it over, he sat up a little straighter. She smiled without meaning to. Small victories mattered here. She fed him with slow, careful movements. Oatmeal again, thinned and warm, with just a pinch of powdered jerky crushed in for strength. He licked it off the spoon with more purpose this time. His hands, still clumsy, tried to grab the bowl. She let him hold it for a moment, keeping her own hands nearby just in case. When it tipped sideways and dumped half the contents onto the blanket, Bracken froze. His face crumpled, not in pain, not in anger, but in some deeply primal embarrassment. The kind that comes when a creature expects punishment because it's never known anything else. Helen didn't raise her voice. She only chuckled softly, reached for the spilled oatmeal with a rag, and said, "Happens to all of us." And just like that, his shoulders loosened. Later that morning, she watched him explore the cabin for the first time under full strength. He moved cautiously at first, testing the floor, the chairs, the edge of the hearth. His steps were wide and low to the ground, almost like a bear cub learning its own weight. But when he discovered the wooden ladle hanging by the stove, he gripped it like a treasure. She watched from the doorway as he tapped it experimentally against the floor. Then the chair leg. Then the metal rim of the stove. When the third hit gave off a satisfying clang, his face shifted. His mouth opened just slightly. A strange, breathy huff escaped. A sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a growl. He did it again. Clang. This time, it sounded like joy. She blinked. Bracken turned toward her, held up the spoon like a prize, and let out a huff twice as loud. Helen laughed, full and from the chest. For a moment, it filled the whole cabin. A woman who once feared the sound of her daughter crying now found herself smiling at the racket of a baby Bigfoot banging kitchenware like it was a drum set. That night they sat together near the stove. She had started to teach him things. Simple words, basic signs. When she pointed to the chair and said, "Chair," he tilted his head. When she touched her chest and said, "Helen," he watched her mouth carefully. She repeated it 3 times. He didn't try to mimic the word, but he did reach out and place his hand where hers had been. Then he touched his own chest, lightly. Not the same sound, not even a sound at all. But the motion was deliberate. He was learning. He was trying. They developed their own small vocabulary. When he was hungry, he pointed to his mouth. When tired, he leaned into her side and exhaled deeply. When he heard something outside the cabin and grew anxious, he would place a hand flat against her chest, as if confirming her heartbeat. She always let him. It became the new language between them. Hand on heart meant safety. Still here. Still breathing. On the 3rd morning, Helen found more footprints outside. Larger ones. Farther apart. They circled the clearing again but stayed outside a consistent, invisible perimeter, as if the ones watching had decided this cabin now belonged to the child, and by extension, to her. Each day, a new braid of dried grass appeared, left on the porch, hung on a low branch nearby, tied carefully to the porch railing. They weren't threatening. They were messages, silent acknowledgments, a kind of ancient nod from the shadows. She kept them all in a small wooden bowl beside the fire. Bracken watched her collect them each day. He never reached for them, but when he saw her tuck them gently into the bowl, his shoulders seemed to settle, just slightly more each time. One afternoon, Helen retrieved a fresh tape from the recording station in the woods. She played it back that night after dinner, the crackle of the old equipment filling the space as she leaned back into the rocker. At first, it was just forest noise. Wind, leaves, the distant trill of an owl. Then came the knocks. Rhythmic. Not quite random. Like someone trying to speak in a language just beyond hearing. And then it came, a sound long and deep. Not growling, not singing. Something between the two. A calling. It stretched across the tape like a note from a horn. Low and searching. Rising and then dropping off as if waiting for a reply. Bracken's head snapped up. His eyes went wide, pupils flaring with something sharp and immediate. He rose unsteadily, moved to the speaker, and pressed his hand against it. A low whine escaped his throat. Then he backed away slowly and stumbled into Helen's arms. She held him without speaking. His face buried itself under her chin. He didn't sob. But the sound in his chest vibrated like grief waking up again after he fell asleep. She sat with her old nurse's journal open in front of her, pen in hand. She wrote 1 sentence. Then she crossed it out. She wrote another. What does it mean to save someone if the saving keeps them from finding home? She stared at the line, then underlined it. A few days later, a man from the supply team arrived early. Too early. A delivery of fuel, canned food, and winter gear. She heard the engine before she saw him, panicked for a second, then ushered Bracken into the rear storage room and gently motioned for him to stay silent. He obeyed. He didn't cry. The man knocked, cheerful in his wool cap and gloves. He smelled like gasoline and breakfast sausage. While he unloaded, Helen made small talk. Snowfall, supply routes, weather ahead. Then, just as he was climbing back into the truck, he paused. "Ma'am," he said, holding something in his hand. "You dropped this?" It was the wooden ladle. Teeth marks, huge ones, bit deep into the handle. Helen blinked. "Oh, I probably left that outside. I use it to stir the fire sometimes." He looked at it again. "Big dog?" She smiled with her mouth, not her eyes. "Bigger." He handed it over, laughed, then drove off. She watched the truck disappear down the road. Then she locked the door and leaned back against it, heart racing. That night, Bracken touched the scar on her left hand, the one she'd gotten years ago trying to stop a patient from pulling out their IV. She told him stories he couldn't understand, about her husband's jokes and her daughter's first steps. He listened anyway, and then, without prompting, he placed his hand over her heart. She broke, not loudly, not suddenly, just enough that her voice cracked. "You hear me?" she whispered. "You really hear me?" He didn't reply. He just pressed his forehead to hers. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone in her grief. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the fire held steady. And for the first time in years, Helen laughed because someone knocked over a pot. Not because life had stopped hurting, but because somehow, impossibly, it had started meaning something again. She turned to look at the window, snow painting soft shadows on the glass, and whispered, "Maybe this winter won't be about surviving after all." And somewhere beyond the trees, the mountain listened. The wind came first, loud and directionless, lifting snow in small tornadoes that danced across the clearing. Then came the crack. It didn't echo like a tree falling. It sounded like something splitting under pressure, something metallic. Helen looked up from where she was slicing dried apples and saw movement through the kitchen window. A tall pine, one of the ones that had partially collapsed over the buried trail weeks ago, had shifted. A few smaller trunks had broken clean beneath it, making way, and in doing so, a section of mangled antenna wire now dangled from the trees like a silver vein freshly opened. She didn't move right away. Her hand stayed on the knife, and for a long second, the only thing she heard was Bracken's soft humming behind her as he played with the kindling basket near the stove. But then came another thought. If the antenna wire had shifted, if part of it had come free, then maybe, just maybe, she dropped the apple, grabbed her boots, and stepped outside without a coat. The cold sliced straight through her sweater, but she didn't care. The snow had softened in the sun just enough for her boots to break through the crust with each step. She moved quickly, her breath ragged, her hands shaking more from what this could mean than from the cold. The end of the cable had caught in a low branch. The break wasn't clean, but the copper was visible, twisted and wet. She followed it uphill, searching with her eyes, then spotted the main shaft of the antenna half buried in slush. It wasn't salvageable, but the wires were still good. She dropped to her knees, brushing snow away with bare fingers. Her mind moved without hesitation, an old rhythm kicking in from the years when broken medical machines needed field fixes mid-crisis. She pulled out her pocket knife, stripped the insulation with short, careful strokes, found the cleanest match point, and began to twist the wire ends together. When she finished, she ran back inside and turned on the shortwave radio. A soft pop, then static, then nothing. She adjusted the tuner, eyes locked on the dial, ears straining. Static shifted, then broke. A long beat of silence, then, "Hello? Laurel Fork Station. Do you copy?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed the receiver. "This is Helen Morrow, Laurel Fork Cabin. I read you." A pause. Then, "Helen. God, we thought you were snowed under. Kincaid's been checking in twice a week. We haven't heard a signal since the storm. I'm here," she said. "The road's still buried. Antenna was damaged. I just got partial function restored." "We'll notify Kincaid," the voice said. "Hang tight. Weather looks clear. He'll want to speak with you directly." "Thanks," Helen replied, but her voice was quieter now. She already knew what that meant. The world had found her again. 2 hours later, The radio hissed to life again. This time, Kincaid's voice crackled through, filtered by distance and barely contained curiosity. "Morrow, status update?" Helen exhaled slowly. "The road's washed out past marker 12. Supplies are holding. I've been managing." Another pause. "We received partial audio from a bipedal subject near Mike Station B6 4 days ago. Very close range. Sounds deliberate." Helen didn't answer. "Have you had any interactions?" She looked over at Bracken, who was sitting cross-legged in front of the fire, humming quietly to the beat of his own wooden spoon drum. He looked up, smiled. No fangs, no threat. Just a child who had survived more than most ever would. "Yes," she said. "I've had direct contact. A juvenile." Static pulsed. "Is it still alive?" "Yes." "How close?" "It's here." The pause was longer this time. "In the cabin?" "Yes." Now the voice changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by something sharper, quieter. "You understand the significance of this?" Helen didn't reply. "You are in possession of the first known biological subject of this species. Your observations, even without lab tools, are critical. We'll need samples, hair, blood, if possible. Behavioral notes, diet, elimination, the works." Helen closed her eyes. "You'll also need to secure the subject. Make sure it doesn't flee before retrieval." Retrieval. That word landed like a stone. She opened her eyes. "How soon are you coming?" "Road crews estimate 3 weeks. That's weather permitting. We'll come prepared." She looked at Bracken again. He had turned his head slightly, watching her now, his expression unreadable. Kincaid's voice returned. "And Helen, if there are signs of disease, we'll need full logs. If the subject shows instability or high aggression, we'll have to treat it as a potential biological risk. You know the protocol." Helen's voice turned to ice. "Clarify that. Containment, removal if necessary. We can't risk outbreak or contamination. This isn't a petting zoo." She didn't hang up. She set the receiver down like it was burning her hand, then turned off the radio. Bracken still watched her. She knelt slowly and extended her hand. He placed his palm against hers without hesitation. He didn't need words. He had seen the shift in her eyes. That night, after he slept, Helen sat at the kitchen table with the letter she'd once written to her daughter folded in half before her. It was stained now, smudged from being carried in her coat pocket too long. She hadn't looked at it in weeks. The words inside were full of apologies and soft ends. She read the lines again, slowly, as if grieving them. Then she lit a match. One edge caught. She fed the paper piece by piece into the stove. Ash curled into the firebox and vanished. She sat back in the rocking chair and watched the flames for a long time. "This isn't about me leaving anymore," she whispered. "This is about staying, and what that means." In the quiet, the wind passed across the roof like a sigh. She got up and opened her notebook. In neat capital letters, she wrote, "New plan, teach him to live without me." Over the next 2 days, she didn't speak to Bracken differently, but her eyes had changed. Each thing she showed him had a purpose now. How to tie knots, how to listen for different bird calls, how to recognize the rumble of a truck engine from miles off, how to hide when that sound came too close. She taught him how to recognize trap wire, how to find high ground, which trees bore food even in bad winters, which caves carried warm air. They walked farther into the woods now. He followed close, silent and attentive. Every time she paused, he mimicked her breath. When she ducked low beneath a branch, he followed. When she pointed at a fresh paw print in the snow, he crouched and sniffed. She watched him with awe and sorrow braided so tightly together she couldn't tell them apart. At night, she didn't write about him anymore. She wrote for him. Instructions. Notes. A list of places nearby with red berries. A sketch of the hill where bees nested but didn't sting if approached slowly. A small map etched on the back of a recipe card showing the rock formation shaped like a wolf's head, where water always flowed even when the creek dried. She didn't say the word goodbye. Not even once. But everything she did said it for her. On the 4th day, Bracken found her staring at the sky. Snow had stopped falling, The sun filtered through the clouds like gold bleeding through cotton. He approached her, brow furrowed. She smiled gently. "You'll be okay," she said, not expecting him to understand. "They'll come for you if I can't. And if they don't, then you'll still know the path." He reached out, placed his hand on her chest, and for the first time, she placed her hand over his. He didn't purr. He didn't hum. He just stood there, eyes locked on hers, and gave her silence so full it made her ribs ache. Later that night, while he slept, she folded one of the grass braids from the porch into her coat pocket and whispered, "You're not a specimen." Then softer, "You're not mine to keep." The snow outside whispered against the windows like a tide trying to remember how to come home, and she sat up late, planning more lessons she didn't want to give. Lessons about leaving, about hiding, about never trusting a human voice with too many questions. And far below the ridge, at the base of the old road, the forest held its breath, because the world was on its way, and this time it would not knock. The storm came early. Snow fell like it had something to say, heavy, silent, deliberate. It blanketed the roof of the cabin and clung to every tree limb, weighing the forest down into stillness. Helen could feel it before it arrived. This storm wasn't just weather. It was a sign. Something had shifted. Nature, as always, spoke first. She had just finished marking the second notebook with Bracken's learning progress. His gestures, his patterns of breath, the shapes he'd started carving into the porch railings. A language not meant for any human tongue. She paused by the window, the lantern's reflection soft on the glass. The path behind the woodshed had vanished. No footprints, no deer, no sound. Then she heard it. Not thunder, not wind, a howl. Low, guttural, not canine, not human. Her spine straightened. Bracken had gone quiet too. He had been playing with a strip of fabric from the quilt she'd let him pull apart. But now he froze, ears twitching, head turned slightly toward the window even before she moved. She stepped outside, just one step. The cold hit her in the teeth. But the sound came again, this time closer. Not just one voice, several. They weren't calling to her. They were calling to him. Bracken stood behind her now, silent, unmoving. Then, in a moment so slow it seemed unearthly, he took one step forward, then another. She turned to him, blocking his way. "No," she whispered. "Not yet." He didn't growl, didn't resist, but in his eyes something flickered. Not fear, not defiance. Recognition. Something or someone was out there, and they were looking for him. She bolted the door that night. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew what instinct could do when the old blood called. She watched him curl into his corner near the stove, hands pressed to his own chest, as if trying to remember who he belonged to. By dawn, the wind had died, but the air was too still. Helen rose before light and moved to the back pantry. It was there, tucked in a crate beside a box of rusted screws and old lantern wicks. Her husband's field camera. She hadn't touched it in years. Not since his final trip, when he swore he'd seen something just beyond the ridge near Devil's Backbone, and the photos had come back fogged, smudged with streaks of light no technician could explain. She powered it on. The battery still held charge. She stepped outside. The snow was chest deep in some places, but her legs pushed through like a woman walking with a purpose she didn't entirely understand. She didn't need to. All she knew was this. She had to see what he'd seen. She followed the trail Bracken had started to carve weeks earlier. A subtle pattern of notches in the bark. Half-covered rocks left facing certain directions. Broken twigs angled in ways no wind could arrange. She walked for 20 minutes before finding it. A pattern in the snow, not footprints. Marks, shapes, lines drawn in arcs, circles, slashes, overlapping rings like ripples in ice. She raised the camera and snapped 3 shots. Then she noticed something else. A single length of cedar bark, tied in a knot around a small piece of antler. She picked it up. It wasn't old. Still smelled of Bracken's breath. He'd left it here, but not for her. When she turned around, she almost screamed, because something was standing at the edge of the trees. Massive, still, covered in frost. It wasn't bracken. It was taller, broader. The fur around its shoulders shimmered with age, streaked with gray. Eyes, amber like brackens, watched her without blinking. She didn't move. The creature raised one hand, open-palmed. Not threatening, not beckoning, just seen. Then it turned and vanished back into the trees. She lowered the camera, her fingers shaking. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. She knew now. Bracken wasn't the only one. Back in the cabin, she said nothing. Just sat beside him and handed him the piece of cedar. He took it in silence, then placed it beside the fire. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Bracken grew restless. He began pacing the cabin after dusk, his hands fluttering against the walls like he was searching for a memory embedded in the logs. He ate less, slept less, and every time the wind picked up, he stared toward the door like it was singing his name. Helen knew the signs. He was being called, and part of her hated it, because it meant that what they had, the safety, the quiet, the impossibly strange bond, was borrowed time. But something in her shifted too. It happened the moment she went to clean the upper loft and found the journal, her husband's journal, the one she thought was lost on his final hike. She didn't remember packing it, didn't remember bringing it here. But there it was, half covered in dust, tucked beneath an old blanket she hadn't touched since moving in. She opened it. The pages crackled. His handwriting was jagged, erratic in some places, but clear. March 4th. Snowed in near Backbone Ridge. Saw it again. Same eyes, same gait. Not a bear, not a man. It left markings, spirals in ash, left something by the fire pit, a braid of moss and bone, like a message. I think they're watching. I don't think they mean harm. I think they remember. She closed the journal, then opened it again, and this time, she noticed something taped between the last 2 pages. A photograph, blurred, but unmistakable. A figure tall and wide, half shrouded by tree shadow. A smaller shape beside it, child-sized. They were holding hands. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just placed the photograph beside Bracken's drawing pile and waited. That night, Bracken picked it up. He stared at it for a long time, then looked at her. His hand touched his chest, then pointed to the door, and for the first time, he spoke. Not a word, not English, but a sound. Low, soft, resonant. A name. His and hers, entwined. Helen stood. Her knees trembled, but her voice didn't. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." She didn't take the radio. She didn't take the notebooks. She didn't even take her coat. Just the braid he made her, and the memory of a man who once stood where she now stood. They walked for hours, through snow deeper than she remembered, through silence heavier than any grief, and when they reached the grove, the one with the twin cedars twisted like arms wrapped in prayer, she saw them, all of them, 6, maybe 7, figures emerging from the trees like shadows reborn. None moved, none spoke, until the oldest stepped forward. It was the same one from the tree line. It raised its hand again. This time, Bracken stepped toward it. He turned back once, eyes wide, not sad, just full. Helen nodded. That was enough. He crossed the space between them and placed his hand into the larger one. The others circled around, but not like a pack, like a family. Helen stepped back, but didn't turn away. She watched as they vanished, one by one, into the woods. And when the final shape disappeared, the wind picked up again. This time, it didn't howl. It sang. A low, steady hum, not unlike the one Bracken used to make when falling asleep. She stood there for a long time, until the cold kissed her skin too hard to ignore. Then she walked home, alone, but lighter, and inside the cabin, something flickered on the table. The camera. The battery, long dead, blinked. One red light, then gone. She didn't question it, just smiled, and began writing. Not an account, not for science, but a message, something someone else might find, years from now, in a storm just like this one. She wrote, "I didn't save him. I just waited long enough for him to remember who he was." Then, without ceremony, she folded the page and tucked it behind the wood stove. Outside, the wind carried the faintest scent of cedar, and somewhere in the trees, A boy was humming again, but this time the sound didn't bounce back off walls. It was answered, and the answer came not in words, but in belonging, and the echo kept going. The night sky hung heavy above the ridge, velvet dark, soaked with the scent of pine, ash, and something older, like time itself had paused to breathe. Not a single cricket sang, not a single leaf rustled, and that silence, that deep, ancient silence, pressed down on Maggie's chest like a memory she hadn't yet lived. The cold was no longer something outside her skin. It had seeped in, not bitter, but grounding, like the earth asking her to stay a little longer. Rust Fern's tiny heartbeat thumped softly against her ribs, the way a child might press a cheek to their mother's back to feel safe. Maggie cradled him tighter beneath the shawl of her husband's old flannel, the camera still looped around her neck, its weight now less mechanical, more sacred. She stood beneath the shadow of the granite outcrop where it all began, the place where the mother had left the carved wooden message, the place where silence had once meant danger, but now it felt more like reverence. She hadn't told anyone, not Joel, not her sister, not even her own mirror, but she had known. Somewhere between finding the journal footage and feeling the dried pine sap etched into the wooden figurine, Maggie had known. The mother would come, not out of sentiment, not out of gratitude, but because they shared something that crossed bloodlines and species, grief. That's when the wind shifted. A low, humming groan rolled through the forest. Not animal, not weather. A call. Maggie didn't move. She didn't have to. Her heart was moving fast enough for both of them. She turned her head slowly, and there, emerging from the pines like a memory made of fur and shadow, stood the mother. Her eyes weren't glowing. No cliché, no drama, just eyes, deep and amber, full of something that refused to be named. Rage, maybe. Fear. Love. It was all in there, braided into the way her shoulders rose and fell, the way her massive hands flexed as if unsure whether to reach forward or retreat. Rust Fern stirred beneath the coat. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't call. She simply stepped forward. One step, then another. Her boot crunched over old snow and broken needles. The mother did not move, but her breathing changed. It was audible now, labored, holding something back. Maggie dropped to her knees, not from weakness, but as offering. Then she unwrapped the coat. Rust Fern blinked up at the moon, his wide eyes catching the silver glow like the surface of a still pond. He looked at her, really looked, and then past her. And for the first time since she found him, he made no sound. No cry, no frightened call, only stillness. The mother inhaled. Maggie had read about that breath in her husband's journals. The intake of recognition, the knowing, the kind of breath a creature takes when it smells its own kind, not by scent, but by soul. The forest waited. Then the mother stepped forward, her massive hands trembling as they reached out, paused mid-air, then descended slowly like fog touching earth. One hand scooped the cub with impossible gentleness, the other brushing Maggie's arm. Not with violence, but with something that might have once been a thank you in another world. She didn't linger. She turned, cradled her child against her chest, and disappeared into the dark like a ghost that had finally been given permission to stop haunting. Maggie stayed there, on her knees, for minutes, maybe hours. She didn't cry. Not yet. The body holds certain emotions like locked safes. You feel the weight before the key is even made. When she rose, she didn't feel lighter. She felt rewritten. The hike back to the cabin was quieter than the one up. Her boots didn't protest the ice. Her legs didn't feel like anchors anymore. She walked like someone who had walked through something irreversible and come out different. The lantern was still burning by the front step when she arrived. Joel was asleep in the truck, arms folded tight across his chest like a child caught napping during Sunday service. Maggie smiled and let him rest. She knew the kind of waiting he'd done. Inside, the cabin was warm, too warm. She opened the window a crack, letting in a breath of cold that didn't chill. It clarified. On the table sat the journal, still open to the last page her husband had written. Sometimes the only way to prove we're human is to do something no one would expect a human to do. She touched the ink like it might still be wet. The camera hung from her neck like a pendant now. Not a tool, not evidence, just a memory box. A beating archive of everything that mattered and couldn't be said. She didn't watch the footage again. Not yet. Some things need time to settle in your bones before they make sense in your mind. Instead, she turned to the window. The wind had picked up again, but it no longer howled. It whispered, and maybe, just maybe, she thought she heard something far off, deep in the ridges, singing back. Weeks passed, not fast, not slow, just steady. The way healing moves, the way winter starts to step back, not in retreat, but in release. Joel stopped by most days now, not to ask questions, just to be there. He fixed the old porch swing, not because she asked, but because he missed the sound it made when it creaked in the morning. Maggie began carving again. Nothing big, just little things. A tiny wolf, a pine tree, a cub. Each one held something she didn't try to name. She placed them on the windowsill like silent sentinels watching the forest. Then one afternoon, mid-March, the mail came. A letter. No return address, no stamp. Just one word burned into the envelope with heat instead of ink. Ode. Inside, a single photograph. Grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. The mother, holding rust fern. Not hiding, just being. In the background, barely visible, stood something else. A figure, taller, older, watching them both. A father, maybe, or something even older. And on the bottom edge of the photo, written in what looked like charcoal, "Your kindness echoed." Maggie didn't show the picture to Joel. She didn't need to. Some things aren't proof, they're promises. That night, she sat by the fire. The same fire that once felt like a wall between her and the world. Now it felt more like a bridge. And as the embers crackled and the wind curled beneath the door, Maggie whispered something no one else would hear. But something, out there in the trees, would answer. Not in words, but in returning footsteps. In carved wood left gently on a porch rail. In a second chance. In the sound of something massive passing quietly in the night. Not breaking branches, but bending them back into place. Sometimes, the most powerful things in life are the ones that happen in silence. In places no one talks about. Far from cities, far from logic, far from the noise of everything that tells us what's real and what isn't. And yet, it's in those quiet corners, deep in the woods, high in the mountains, or hidden inside a single act of kindness, that the truth waits. Not the truth you can prove, but the truth you feel. There's something ancient that still lingers in this world. Something not built by humans, but carried in us, like a memory older than names. It doesn't speak in our language, doesn't follow our rules. It watches, it remembers, and every now and then it answers. Not with words, but with presence, with return, with grace. The wild doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply listens. And when it recognizes compassion, it leans in. Not because it needs saving, but because it remembers what it means to be seen without fear. This story wasn't about proof or logic or winning. It was about choosing to open a door, even when the world tells you to lock it. It was about answering a cry that wasn't human and realizing maybe we aren't so different after all. That maybe what makes us human is the way we choose to protect something that can't say thank you. We live in a world so obsessed with certainty, we forget the sacredness of mystery. But mystery is where faith lives. It's where forgiveness hides. It's where healing begins. And maybe the most extraordinary moments in life don't come from what we can control, but from the things we choose to love, even when we don't understand them. If this story found a quiet corner in your heart, if it stirred something wordless in your spirit, then maybe it was meant for you. Because in the end, kindness is never wasted, and sometimes the wild remembers. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, we'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, or what part of the story touched you most. And if you believe more people need stories like this, stories of hope, wonder, and quiet redemption, consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and helping us grow a community rooted in empathy, mystery, and connection. Until next time, stay curious, and above all, stay kind.